Everyone, if I could have your attention. Thank you. Hi, I'm Carrie Logan. I think I've spoken to most of you recently about participating in the stakeholders group, and I really want to thank you all for being here. And I want to thank you for taking the time to be patient with us as we form this group. We are moving as quickly as we can on a lot of these issues, and so we thank you both for your patience and for your participation. I do want to thank the members of the Metro Council that are here with us, Councilman Bedney, I think I saw Council Lady Gilmore, Council Lady Allen, Councilman Mendez, Council Lady Blaylock, I did see you here too. And hi, Council Lady Johnson is here as well. Hi, Brett. Councilman Withers, thank you. And also members of the Planning Commission who are here, Chairman McLean, Commissioner Clifton, thank you for joining us. I think both Commissioners Farr and Hayes had other engagements tonight. This is our first stakeholders group, and we plan on having several of these throughout the process. For this portion of the participation, the stakeholders should be seated at these two tables, and then we do have some seating for the public here to observe during the process. And we do have forms for the public to fill out if they have any specific issues, though the participation today will be for stakeholders, those in the stakeholder group. I think there's been some at least we're concerned that there was a miscommunication that this was a meeting for public input. This meeting is not for public input, but future meetings would be. So if we could just take a second and go around and introduce ourselves to everyone, I think that would be great. And then I'll let David with EPS get started with his presentation. Councilman?
Well, welcome everybody. My name is Fabian Bedne. I'm a Metro Councilman for District 31, and I'm also the chair of the Ad Hoc Affordable Housing Committee of the Council.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stan. I'm Erica Gilmore, and I'm a council at large, and I'm a part of the Ad Hoc Committee as well. Look forward to hearing the recommendations.
Good afternoon. I'm Judy Cummings, and I'm the president of the Interdenominational Ministers Fellowship, and I am also executive member of NOAA, Nashville Organized for Action and Hope on the Affordable Housing Task Force.
Berkeley Allen, council member for District 18, and I've served on the Homelessness Commission for the past 2 years, so looking at that.
Council Lady Dept, Blaylock, District 27, and I'm also on the
I'm Postman. I facilitate a coalition of voices in Nashville called The Voice for the Reduction of Poverty. Also affiliated with a whole slew of others interested in issues related to housing. A proud member of the NOAA Affordable Task Force, and hopefully all of your friends.
Jim Harbison, Executive Director in DHA.
Andy Herron, Deputy Manager.
Jaron Springer with the Greater Nashville Association of Realtors.
Michael Kenner with Micah Development, real estate developer.
David Schwartz with Economic and Planning Systems. Brandon Burnett with the Metro Planning Department.
Jim Fraser, professor at Vanderbilt University and working with the team out of Denver.
Paul Johnson with the Housing Fund.
Eric Cole, I'm here representing Mayor Megan Barry.
Stuart Clifton on the Metro Planning Commission and constituent of Berkeley Allen.
Andy Lattimore with Affordable Housing Research.
Jim McCann, Avenue Bank, board member of Habitat, and Bill Murray.
Bill Hofstetler, HMD, Real Estate, Home Builder.
Jimmy Granberry, HTO Builder.
Wood Caldwell, Southeast Nation.
Bob Mendez, Metro Council.
Adrian Harris with the Housing Fund.
I'm Daniel Norton. I'm a multi-classroom leader at Bordeaux Illinois Center.
Rod Williams, I'm a stakeholder by virtue of being a citizen and taxpayer.
I'm also not a part of the official group, but my name is John Stern, and I'm Chairman Emeritus of the Nashville Neighborhood Alliance, as well as the Donaldson Hermitage Chamber Neighborhood Association, as well as Lake Park Neighborhood Association, and I live in Painting Ridge now.
I'm Kelly Bonady. I'm a commercial real estate developer, and I work with the community in North Nashville.
I'm Sam Powell with American Medical Group, not with College.
Garrett, I'm a civil engineer with Dillon Associates. We do a lot of designs around town, and happy to be part of the group.
Jim McLean, Chairman of the Metropolitan Planning Commission.
Rita McDonald with the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce.
Mina Johnson, council member from District 23, also member of Planning, Zoning, and Historical Review.
James Weaver Waller, purpose teacher.
And last but not least, Debbie Frank with Urban Blueprint, and I'm also a board member of the Housing Fund.
And Avi and I forgot, we're also here for the mayor's transition team on affordability and access, and we'll be giving her recommendations. Oops.
Thank you. I do also need to mention one person who could not be with us today. Doug Sloan is in Massachusetts at the Big City Directors Institute, and so he is meeting with a lot of other directors from a lot of other cities who are having similar problems to what we're having right now on all sorts of issues. So he apologizes for not being here. But David?
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, everybody who is sitting around these tables. We're delighted to be working with the city on addressing and identifying some very serious and profound issues that the city is experiencing because of its great attractiveness, its community character, its lifestyle, and a lot of other reasons why people are moving here that are creating some of what might be considered the housing problems. I'm David Schwartz. I'm a vice president with Economic and Planning Systems. We are a full-service urban economics consulting firm. I'm from the Denver office. We have 3 other offices, and we serve public and private sector clients throughout the U.S. About 40% of our work right now is with the private sector, so we work a lot with developers, both single-family developers, multifamily developers, that is residential and non-residential development. We do market and financial feasibility analysis. We work on public-private partnership negotiations, structuring deals between entities. We also work on the public side, not only, of course, with cities and counties, but we work with states. We work with MPOs. We work with transit authorities and agencies, public housing authorities. We work with chambers of commerce, economic development authorities, urban renewal authorities, with a whole host of types of clients on assessing a variety of different issues that are related to urban economics. This, as you see from this brief list of expertise, this falls under one of the categories or main service areas. Our perspective as a sort of a third-party analyst and as an unbiased economist is we are not an advocacy position, I should mention. We're not an advocacy organization. We are analysts and economists, and we look at issues and try to reveal where data and trends indicate that there are problems in the case of this type of a study. But we also have we also work a great deal, as I mentioned, with the development community and understand how developers make decisions, for example, how housing developers make decisions and what risks they take, what they're looking for. And we work on the side of the public sector to ensure that when there are negotiations, when there is an ask, that there is something appropriately and commensurately given in return for that. So in this study, we're sort of drawing on our experiences from both the public and the private sector, from our housing policy and feasibility work around the country, also our understanding of economic and fiscal impact, because that will also enter the equation eventually as we work through this process. I want to give a little overview before we start into the data analysis piece of where we are up to this point. And I want to say too that in terms of where we are up to this point, this is the first meeting of several stakeholder meetings with all of you. This is also the beginning of the process of reaching out and engaging with stakeholders, either individually, in groups, that is focus groups, or in other types of interview settings to understand and allow you the opportunity to give us your input, your feedback, your comments, suggestions, your ideas about what types of incentives might work, in terms of what types of policies wouldn't work or would work, what types of resources would be valuable to you, what types of resources wouldn't be valuable to you, and how we can begin to formulate some ideas about looking at that data through the lens of what might work regionally, what might work locally, what might work from the perspective of leveraging economic or land use or financial resources to address what is, I think, clearly acknowledged as a housing affordability problem. Whether or not there is agreement at this moment about where that problem lies and what its causes are is another issue that we can delve into as we progress through this evening and also through the rest of this process. So I want to step back and take a look at a couple things that we have found fairly consistent among a lot of communities facing similar issues of housing affordability. One of the problems is that there's often a gap between housing costs and incomes. This first little line here shows inflation. This is the U.S. Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers. You can collect this data on the BLS's website and find the same thing. So between 2000 and 2014, inflation has increased 37%. This is an index to 100 back to 2000. If we add to that median household incomes in the U.S., you see that median household incomes peaked at around the pre-recession time, dipped down for a few years and have come back up, but just at 28% above where their the 2000 level is. The point with showing these two lines is that the cost of goods is often, and on a macro level, is exceeding households' income. So incomes are not keeping pace with the cost of goods and services. And by goods and services, I mean buying retail items, grocery items. It includes also housing. It includes transportation costs, gasoline, insurance costs, etc. Now we add on to that a national index of housing costs, and this is, by the way, the Case-Shiller index of housing costs nationwide. And we see what happened during the housing boom in the early 2000s up to 2006, and what precipitated obviously was a financial crisis and so on. Housing costs have, though, risen after the recovery really took hold nationwide and come up and are now back at 60% above where they were in 2000. The point here is that this creates a gap between, if we're looking at an apples-to-apples comparison between housing cost inflation and incomes, this means that the gap between how much a household, or this means that there is an increasing gap between how much a household can afford and how much housing actually costs to those households. Before we get to the issues of Nashville, I want to just highlight that wages aren't really the only problem in this sort of a context. There are a number of supply-side considerations and influences that really become relevant. There is limited land in many environments. There's a limited housing inventory, and quality of housing inventory affects that as well. Labor costs, material costs affect that, consumer protection laws, financing terms for commercial lending, insurance regulation and pricing also affects all of that. So there are a number of supply-side influences that contribute to housing affordability issues. There are also a number of demand-side influences, such as local and national wage structures, consumer or household spending and preferences for types of housing, amenities, location, proximities are all a part of that. Mere population and employment growth are also demand-side influences, as is redevelopment pressure and, of course, homebuyer financing terms, which have changed considerably over the last few years. But the question to ask in understanding, or at least acknowledging that wages aren't really the only thing we're looking at, one has to ask, and this is relevant to the city's purview at this moment, is what is in the city's purview to address? Can the city really influence anything in terms of lending terms? Can the city influence changes to commercial lending or to home buyer financing? Can the city influence changes to the cost of labor or materials? Can the city increase or decrease its population growth? Can the city leverage land use incentives such as density or height or parking reductions or a whole host of other types of resources that may be land use or financial? Can the city increase wages? So there are a lot of things that affect the issue of housing affordability, and I mention these things up front because as I go through tonight's presentation, I want you all to be thinking about many of these other issues and some of the discussions that we've had so far and many of the discussions that we'll continue to have really revolve around the possibility that there are other issues potentially that are sources of leverage for the city to act on in terms of addressing housing issues. And in terms of addressing housing issues, here is just a categorization of 3 common types of approaches. The middle approach is really the conventional approach. Most cities throughout the country use these types of resources or approaches to address housing and affordability issues. These are federal funding, CDBG, home funding. This is HUD money. As some of you are very well aware, HUD funding has plummeted in the last 5 years, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 30% nationwide, and in local areas like Nashville, it's plummeted even further. So those conventional sources of financing affordable housing efforts are really dwindling, and it elevates the need to find some other resources to address the problem. On the left hand of this are some targeted or focused types of approaches. This is not a comprehensive list, by the way. So there are in some environments and some economies, there are private solutions, employer-based solutions, where a hospital in an area may find it valuable to provide housing for its new nurses, for example, because housing costs are so high, and that is a critical part of the economy that is the healthcare system. And so there are private employer-based solutions that work in some environments. Other environments use residential or commercial linkage programs. Some use inclusionary, that is voluntary or mandatory inclusionary policies. Some use excise taxes, that is a tax on construction materials for development. Others use land banking or land trusts. On the broader side, the reason I should step back, the reason why I say that these are targeted and focused is that we're talking about the market or the component of the community where the responsibility to produce affordable housing is placed. Many of those types on the left side are really targeted and focused policies where you are targeting one sector of the economy to provide a component of the solution to addressing affordable housing needs. Residential and commercial linkage programs target residential development and commercial development, respectively. Excise taxes are taxes on all construction materials. Land banking is a targeted and very limited sort of a form, and that's also in the hands of cities, often using pass-through funding or permanent funding sources. So on the broader side, though, there are other types of approaches, and these are often funding solutions, which involve creating permanent sources of funding, dedicated sources of funding, but that approach the issue from a much broader perspective. That is, the theory is, if the problem is community-wide, then the solution should be proportionally community-wide. So in those environments, there are property taxes, or a portion of a sales tax, or a portion of lodging tax, if you can get the Convention and Visitors Bureau to agree with it, which some communities remarkably have around the country. or even other types of taxes. Head taxes are another possibility, but often chambers of commerce are very opposed to that, as could be anticipated. There are also permanent and housing trust funds. Those are funded often through a variety of different mechanisms. But you can see that there's a wide spectrum of types of approaches, and there are also many other unique approaches to addressing affordable housing issues, depending on really what the problem is, where the problem is coming from, and who should bear a portion of the burden of the responsibility of remedying some of that. A little bit about how you know what tool is appropriate to use. There are two ways to think about this. There are some common vehicles, and I put vehicles in quotation marks because vehicles means, as we talked about the targeted and focused approaches, vehicles are using the vehicle of commercial or residential development as the vehicle to get affordable housing produced. There are other types of vehicles, such as the funding resources, like economically valuable resources like a permanent fund or a dedicated funding source. There is also growth and development pressure. That is also a vehicle for accomplishing goals. And partnerships is often overlooked in some of our economic analysis, not for the sake that it doesn't enter into policy discussions, but because partnerships is something that falls outside of our own purview as economists and analysts and falls on the shoulders of our clients to implement effectively. As much as we can give direction, it falls on the shoulders of the clients to effectively implement that. So in terms of these two things, communities fall into a variety of different quadrants where you may have high growth and low resources available, any types of resources for leverage, or you may have a great deal of resource and not a lot of growth. There are other communities that fall into low growth and low resource. I don't believe that Nashville falls into that category. A note down at the bottom here is my first note to this effect, that there are a lot of different solutions out there. And there are a lot of solutions that are worth talking about. They all need to be tailored to a local environment, because while there are some ideas out there that work very well and very effectively in some communities, not one size fits all is going to work in every situation. So we'll come back to that more later. Leverage. I just want to point out on the aspect of leverage. Leverage can be financial, it could be a land use, it could be a regulatory resource. But leverage means that from the standpoint of, say, the city is identifying through us, through the interviews, through this stakeholder process, what has value to the development community. If we're talking about a policy that involves the development community, we need to understand from the development community, for example, what has value to them, what kind of resources, what kind of incentives have value to the development community. And we also need to understand what the community can offer, because some things, like just point point blank say gap financing in the exact amount of the difference between, say, an affordable house and the market rate house that the unit would have been sold for might be requested and might be the desirable type of leverage to use. In a perfect world, if you had endless resources, you would do that. But often you need to find the intersection between what a community can put forward, what a community has in its bag of resources, that is a carrot, that is an incentive. And the solution often lies somewhere in the balance between the intersection of those two. It doesn't work, for example, in the case of leverage. Leverage of, say, density or height as a resource. Say in certain markets there isn't demand for extra density. There isn't demand for extra height. So that might not work very well in those environments. There are other other resources. We can talk about these later. You can ask me questions about them later. But things like fee structures, fee waivers, lot size minimums, maximum occupancies, which is sometimes highly contentious in some communities, has been, or things like affordable housing preservation easements, which are but mechanisms to preserve affordable housing that often don't burden communities in the same way. So this leaves us now at a point of departure in this presentation, where I'm going to hand it back to Carrie just for a few minutes, and she's going to give us an overview of the process. She's going to tell you what we're supposed to do in the analysis. But I just want to clarify a couple things. That from our perspective, the working assumptions are that Council passed a resolution that directed the Planning Department to look at the feasibility of an inclusionary zoning ordinance. That is our directive, and we are going to look at the feasibility of an inclusionary zoning ordinance. But that's not to say, that is a solution among many solutions that is possible for the city of Nashville. It may or may not be the appropriate solution, but we're going to look at that, and we're going to look at whether or not that tool, among other tools, can get the community to a point where it is addressing its housing issues in an equitable fashion, in an effective fashion, and in a deliberate fashion. So I want to point out that if we look at inclusionary zoning, we are going to look at whether a mandatory approach would be appropriate, whether a voluntary approach would be appropriate, whether it should apply uniformly throughout all the submarkets of the city, whether there should be differences in what its requirements are throughout the city, and also ensure that if incentives are available to be used, that they are used as best and as efficiently as they can be used, and that they are calibrated to what is being asked for. So as Carrie will point out, one of the tasks that we have in this effort is to also look at the feasibility. So we will be talking in greater depth with some of the developers that we have talked to already, and others, to identify the critical assumptions that are involved in that type of an analysis, which we have done for a number of other communities in the recent past and over many years. So how we're treating this is basically that no options are really off of the table at the moment. Inclusionary zoning is a solution. And there are other solutions. If there are multiple solutions that are appropriate for Nashville, we want to understand how those can be best structured. We're not in the business, as I mentioned, we do public-private partnerships. We're not in the business of making one faction of the community angrier than the other. We're in the business of trying to find common ground. We're in the business of trying to find consensus. We're in the business of trying to facilitate compromise. And we are in the business of asking questions and listening to all of you. Our goal, again, is to find an equitable and effective solution that addresses the issues that Nashville is facing. And this is really just the beginning of this process.
I'm going to review just briefly a little bit of the history and then the goals of the RFP, what David's tasked to provide Metro, and also our timeline for completing this. So in May of this year, the Planning Department had issued an RFP for a feasibility study and policy study for inclusionary housing that coincided with the tracking of BL 2015-1139, which gave us the timeline to complete this task. Since getting David and EPS on contract, we have been working with him to get him all of the data that he needs to analyze the situation and sort of formulating the process going forward. We do plan on having additional stakeholder meetings in November and December with the goal of having an ordinance submitted to Metro Council on January 20th, which I believe would be 180 days from when the bill became effective. So the objectives of the RFP are broken down into several tasks. The first task is to start to review data and give us a review of that data as well as the input from you all. You can see in the slide that our RFP identified a stakeholder group of 20, and there are 50 of you in the stakeholder group. So we will be meeting with all of you over the next several months to refine our approach. One of the big questions today is, as David goes through the data, is whether we're missing any data sets that you all think would be valuable for us to analyze through the process. And so with that additional direction, they would prepare a market and economic trends analysis and provide that memorandum to Metro, analyzing the various residential markets by the data sets that we've all gone through today and identified different data sets that need to be looked at. The financial feasibility testing that David just mentioned is once we have some beginnings of recommendations, they will take all of these recommendations and test them for whether they're feasible in Nashville's market to make sure that we're crafting a program that will work in actually creating the units that need to be created. Throughout the process, that one of their tasks is working with the stakeholder group, and that will be continuing throughout the entire process. And lastly, delivering the final report and recommendations that includes everything that they've heard from the stakeholders and all the analysis of data over the last few months. This is just an overview. The ordinance that was passed had many of the same goals, the same purpose, and a lot of the same potential for incentives that was included in the RFP. So there was an alignment of goals to look at the process there. As I mentioned, this is the first portion of the outreach, the stakeholder group, and engaging you throughout the process. We've started targeted interviews today, and I think some of you are aligned for targeted interviews tomorrow. We also plan on having some subject matter focus groups where some developers would be sitting down with the consultants individually to dive down into individual issues, as would lenders, as would advocates. We do plan on having a public meeting, both with sort of a large format public input and also electronic surveys to the extent that we can.
So as Carrie mentioned, this is an overview of some of the data that we have looked at. There are a couple pieces of information, I believe, from the state that that were refused. We were denied access to employment information. So if any of you want to do any strong arming, you're welcome to. It was data that we commonly access for these types of projects. We were sent a denial letter to look at employment data.
What stated reason was in the letter?
Pardon?
What reason was stated in the letter?
Confidentiality. That all of the employees at the State Department of Labor would have to sign a confidentiality agreement who had anything to do with the information before it was released, and that was a lengthy and onerous process they weren't going to pursue.
You could try Tennessee Coalition for Open Government, or the statewide advocacy group for open government.
So we're pursuing what avenues we can. It's an important aspect of the analysis, but otherwise I would have had a fuller employment analysis on this on a geographic basis to look at trends in employment changes. But be as it may, we don't have that, so I just wanted to give you a heads up that that's one of the things that we are missing in this overview. But again, to reiterate what Carrie said, if you see anything or you don't see anything that should be a part of what we're looking at in this, I welcome you to speak up and mention it. Maybe not while I'm trying to present the slides, but at some point when we're talking and asking questions. So with that, there's a starting point for doing an analysis like this. And the first thing is defining what the market area is. I mean, it's not just as simple as looking at the incorporated boundaries of Nashville, Davidson metro government. It's looking at a geography that functions as an economy. That is, it functions as an economic unit where workers choose from within those boundaries to find housing. And this is a definition tailored just specifically for this type of an environment. And then within that geography, there are submarkets or markets where there are distinct supply and demand attributes. The reason for identifying this is that not all areas of a city this size are going to have the same market dynamics. So in looking at any type of a policy or any type of a solution, it wouldn't be realistic to presume that a uniform policy applied throughout the entire geography would be appropriate for all markets. There is, for example, in talking about development, there are developments of different types, different price points occurring throughout the city. There are land values that differ throughout the city, and there are other market dynamics, employment centers that also affect these conditions. So, in looking at submarkets, they need to be geographies that generally are recognized. Sometimes those are neighborhoods. They need to have distinct economic conditions. Land value differentials need to be roughly the same within a submarket. Sales price or rental rates, lease rates for non-residential need to be similar. So some of the things that some communities look at are areas buffered by corridors, highways, roads, census tracts, neighborhoods, planning areas, overlay zones. So we began the task by taking the basic map and identifying first of all where the market is. I'm going to come back to some of this, some of the commuting data later, but I raise this now because we needed to look first at commuting patterns to identify really where the whole trade area was, or the market area is for Nashville. That is, this is the set of outlying communities where most of the city's job holders live. So at the moment, we'll come back to this. There are most of Nashville's jobs are held by people who commute in from other locations. So this is defined as sort of the commute shed or the market area that we're dealing with. So much of the analysis that follows is going to look at conditions in these communities. But as I mentioned, we'll come back to that at another time. One of the ways that some communities look at this is by neighborhood boundaries. There are, frankly, so many neighborhoods and such small neighborhoods and so many non-contiguous neighborhoods defined in the city of Nashville. I'm not so sure this is going to be the best approach to identifying submarkets for Nashville. So perhaps we look at census tracts. This is a common alternative when nothing else is suitable. Zip codes often are often not in alignment with market areas, but we have to look at some of these things. There may be some other approaches to looking at what geographic basis may be appropriate. But once this geographic analysis is done, it does need to, framing the analysis for what kind of data we're looking at means you have to make some considerations for the future, because we're not just trying to plan and analyze for the moment. We're trying to plan, analyze, and make some recommendations for policies that can be implemented, that can be updated, and that can serve the future. So, in my experience working with other communities, some of these things have come up and are relevant for the discussion for all of you. The analysis needs to reflect, and the data needs to reflect what affordable housing needs are, and whether that is a static measure of need or demand, or whether it's sort of a dynamic measure of need. And when I say that, I mean a static measure might be in some communities. Policy has looked at the proximity to bus lines or fixed rail transit as a component of policy. Those are static measures. They may be important considerations, but those things don't really change. Fixed rail isn't going to move. Bus lines might move, but generally not. They follow roadway corridors. So on the other hand, you might look at a dynamic source, something that is more indicative of changing needs or changing demands, such as housing prices. You might look at incomes, but those are less dynamic than housing prices are. You might look at gaps, but then you get into the level of sophistication where we could have a conversation about what data sources are the most complex and what's the most sophisticated to really identify where gentrification is occurring and identify where the greatest housing pressure is. But while that might be a great way to do it, we also have to pass the baton back to the city, and the city has to update some of that information later on. And we need to pass off a recommendation for a policy and data analysis that is it's data that's readily available, it's frequently updated, it's also easily understood because it has to be communicated by elected officials, has to be communicated by other leaders in the community, it has to be, and I would hope that all of you would be able to understand it after we go through several meetings. So in place of some of the complex data sets, sometimes there are proxies for things like land values. Land values are not exactly the easiest metric to identify, or it's not the most commonly available data set. So there may be some proxies for that can be used. So as we think about that, let's get into where we're going with some of the data tonight. I showed at the beginning the incomes, the inflation, housing costs. Those are some of the things that we're going to look at. Inflation and incomes, I think you probably know the story, but I've just put together some of the numbers to show you exactly how it compares to the past, how it compares to the U.S., the national medians, for example, and housing prices as well. Look at trends in residential and non-residential building and the pressures that are coming from those markets. And generally think about where the indicators of problems are. And I'd like to reiterate this last point here. If we miss anything, please mention it and we will evaluate it. So the first one is household median incomes. Household median income in Nashville is the bottom line, the solid red line. That's increased at 1.3% per year from 39,232 to 47,211 in 2014. U.S. median is a little bit higher than that and has increased at a rate of 1.8% per year, slightly higher than Nashville's median household income. The top dotted red line is a measure of HUD's median income. This is calibrated to a 2.5 person household, which is a little bit more in line with where the Nashville average household size sits. And I put this on here because in terms of policy and when you start talking about housing affordability, you need to identify area median income, which comes in terms of percentages. So median income is called 100% AMI. Most policies that use those conventional sources of financing that we looked at, or the conventional tools, the conventional approaches in an earlier slide, address 60% AMI, 80% AMI at the very highest for usually home ownership. And then some of the programs, which are distinct from some of the issues that we're going to deal with in this study, are other lower AMI levels that fall outside of the typical rental area, below 60% AMI. And then there's below 30% AMI, which begins to enter into the conversation of needing supportive services, homeless shelters. But just to be careful about what we're talking about in this conversation, while those are clear and growing problems, the issues that we're trying to deal with right now are at the income levels for more for workforce housing. We're talking about housing for the workforce, for service and community sector workforce. And typically those do not go below 80% AMI, which is the common threshold for ownership housing. So that's just a little bit of defining the terms to ensure that what we're talking about here is generally concerned about a certain portion of those income spectrums. So if we compare the Nashville median household income to the U.S. median household income and inflation, we see a bit of that divergence between the cost of goods and services and households' ability to afford those goods and services. Basically, what this is saying in just sort of chart format is that housing conditions are generally worsened by the fact that as the gap between incomes and the cost of goods increases, it forces households into spending more and more of their income on housing. This is if we take a step back from this and think about your own situation, think about a household's expenditures. We're talking about households' ability to afford what they need, the lifestyle they have come to Nashville for. Households spend money on housing. They spend money on transportation, spend money on food, dining, shopping, entertainment, clothing, insurance, taxes. Some households save money, not everybody does. But there are a lot of expenditure categories that are relevant to this equation. And when any one of those categories is expanded or increases, such as the expanding cost of housing in this case, it puts a strain on the other expenditure categories. You reach a point where households become cost burdened, or they spend less money on dining, they spend less money on shopping, they spend less money on entertainment, and that really comes around to the business community in the end as well, because retailers revolve around business for consumers coming to dine out, to shop, looking to be entertained, on the weekends. So it really this household expenditure issue is a household budget issue. It is an economic and also an economic development issue, because as households have less to spend on other things, as households have to spend more on housing, they spend less on other aspects of what they purchase. Nashville's growth just continues on. I think in the last 5 years, the population has increased about 50,000. If my number is slightly off, I will stand corrected and correct the information. The wage and salary jobs have increased at least 40,000 in just the last 5 years. There's really tremendous growth pressure in this city, and people are coming from outside of this city, moving back home, whatever their story is. Whether they were born here, they moved away, and they're coming back. The stories they're very familiar to communities that are facing these issues. So we did look at residential building permit data. This is all of that residential building data that was geocoded using information from the planning department. This, we're looking at all the dots between our new construction of single family, multifamily projects, every type of residential project.
Are those building permits or rezoning permits?
These are building permits. These are building permits for a new construction only. So this does not include rezonings. It does not include occupancy and use changes. It doesn't include renovations or other types of. This is just new construction. So while there were some difficulties in the data of looking at the residential construction, this is really quite a remarkable chart. I've seen this chart up to about here in a lot of communities. but I haven't seen the 70% increase in activity between 2013 and 14. Now, I mentioned that this is not information from the city's building department. That information was nearly impossible to extract from the data we were able to get, although they did try. Nevertheless, this data source still tells the story that there has been this just tells the story there's tremendous growth pressure. So in many ways, the city is doing something right. And it is what we're looking at is we're trying to understand what the conditions or what the product of that is. It's almost, I think we called it, and it's almost like an embarrassment of riches at the moment where there are so many people who want to move here. It's placing a tremendous amount of pressure. It's really burdening the community. It's in some ways the development community can't build units fast enough. And that is frankly true in this community and in a lot of other communities. There simply isn't enough inventory. The vacancy rates are going down, although we weren't able to collect the appropriate type of rental information later on. Having looked at other sources, the rental vacancy rates are simply unsustainably low, and that means that more and more inventory simply needs to be built. We did also look at the commercial development activity. So pressure is also coming from the non-residential community. That means employment growth. Employment growth is creating pressure for affordable housing. So we looked at that as one indication, and one set of numbers to that is some office market stats. The columns here represent the square footage of office space under construction. So nowhere in the last 15 years has there been this much office square footage under construction. The red line indicates vacancy rates, and it's really too small to tell, but this is 3%, that's 6%, that's 9%. As we've done quite a number of market and financial feasibility studies for non-residential developers, I can tell you that when a market goes below 10%, it usually indicates that a couple things are going to happen. Lease rates are going to increase, vacancies and development is going to be stimulated to build. If they weren't already stimulated to build by known tenants, it really stimulates the market for speculative building. And I'm not exactly sure. I haven't scrutinized the numbers or talked to a commercial broker yet, but I speculate that there might be some spec buildings somewhere in this market. So this office market was just one indication. We did look at retail market conditions and industrial market conditions, but the office market really is indicative of this tremendous growth pressure. The next piece of this, and after this component, we'll sort of pause in this presentation so you have time to process it and ask some questions. But I want to get through this next part, which is the housing market piece of it. So back to some of these line charts. This is a trend in just single family price trends between 2000 and 2015. There are 3 data points on this chart. This is also, by the way, just Nashville. This is not the entire market area that we're looking at. We'll take a look at some of those numbers later. So the solid red line is overall average single-family sales prices. This is collected through just year-to-date 2015. Whenever we were able to get the data, I think it was through September something of this year. The average single-family house prices increased at 4.8% per year from 2000, from 167 to 341. The average sales price of those dotted lines are a little bit confusing. The top line is the average sales price for new product. while there isn't really a best data source for identifying new product, this definition here is that the unit sold is no older than 5 years at the time of its sale. So in some cases, that unit may have been sold twice, but it is generally new product. And it's a way to limit the data set to identify really where a part of the new market for single family is really coming in. And that market has increased at 5.4% per year from 207 basically to 454 in 2015. So quite healthy increases in the market, but putting tremendous pressures on households in the area. So backing to the household median income. Household median incomes are shown in the black lines. The solid black line is the census household median and the HUD household median income. At this point, they're so far down here that it really doesn't matter. So you can see that by comparison, by indexing the two against each other, you see that incomes, while they've increased 20% over this 14-year period, housing costs overall have increased 84%, and for new product have increased 107% over where they were in 2000. We go a little further out to 2015 because some of the data sets we had 2015, median income has increased a little bit according to HUD, which means that when the census comes out with their numbers, it'll probably be slightly higher. Nevertheless, housing has continued from 2014 to 15. Overall, I think overall that number there is striking from the 84% above 2000 to 103% above the 2000 levels for overall product, and then new product higher than that. By comparison to other cities, I'm sort of stepping lightly around even bothering with comparisons at this point because we're really looking at the conditions locally and regionally. It is still useful to point out that by comparison to the U.S., pulling back that Case-Shiller price index, this is, if nothing else, an indication of really how hot the Nashville market is. In fact, one of the interesting things that this points out is that nationally the housing market really peaked earlier than it did in Nashville, and I've seen that in a couple other communities. But one thing that is really remarkable about this trend is that Nashville has clearly recovered from the recession, at least using this as one indication, far faster than many other cities in the country, and you can see that by how quickly the trends in sales prices rebound. Many other communities faced 35 to 50% drops in their average pricing of housing, and took many years to recover. Some markets have only just recovered their pre-recession levels of housing prices, and even residential construction activity. I didn't point out, but I should have, on that previous slide of residential construction, that while it was a 70% increase of building activity from 13 to 14, there's still a market increase from 14 to 15, presumably, and not to mention the fact that that level of construction exceeds pre-recession highs. So this is really a strong market in which it's probably, you're not dealing with this issue. You can't deal with this issue soon enough, is basically what we could say from this. And this is just an indication that we did look at this on a geographic basis. Many of the things that we can look at on a geographic basis, we will, for the sake of looking at later on in policy considerations and geography considerations, how policy might be structured, how incentives might be constructed differently to reflect market dynamics, to reflect development feasibility considerations, and so on. So when we aggregate that sales data up to, and this is the census tract level because clearly this wasn't going to work with those neighborhood boundaries. Zip codes were a bit too large in some ways, and there were some other arbitrary boundaries that we found. I think the realty community actually uses 8 sections of the city, which don't really reflect markets. They're simply arbitrary boundaries. So we looked at this on the basis of census tracts, simply for the sake of making a map like this that shows where in the city overall price appreciation has been strongest. And this is color coded so that there are hatched areas where there was either no price appreciation or there was, in fact, this is showing negative, but there was inadequate data to really assess a number. The green and ramping up through the red colors shows green is an overall price appreciation. By overall price appreciation, too, I mean 2000 to 2015. So again, think in your minds about those overall price appreciation numbers that I was showing on previous slides, where price appreciation of overall product between 2000 and 2014 for single family was 84%. So compare that 84% to where some of these symbols indicate in that legend. So green is 1 to 25%. The lighter green is 26 to 50%, all the way up to the red, which is really in the, obviously I don't need to point that out, is 150% and above. In fact, there was one census tract in there that measured out at 627% increase over the year 2000. I didn't identify which one it was. It's immaterial at this point in the analysis. This is just illustrative of what's going on. We'll look at this in a different way. We could look at this in terms of annual price appreciation. I must have said something. That's good. You didn't fall asleep, at least. Another way to look at this, and I think in the next slide or the next 2 slides, there's a break for questions. I think we've reached a critical mass of substance of looking at some numbers and talking about some things that'll be time to open up the floor for questions from the stakeholders. But this is just another map, another way to look at this. This is annual price appreciation. So recall those price appreciation numbers for overall. That overall price appreciation for a single family product was, does anybody remember? 4.8% from 2000 to 2014. So that 4.8% is really going to fall in orange areas like that. Anything above is in red, and so you can see where those red areas are. That means annual price appreciation in single-family homes in all those red areas is anywhere from 5 to 15% on an annual basis. So, you know, think about this again in the context of the other numbers that we were looking at. Inflation has increased at about 1.3% annually. Nashville's median household income has increased at about 1.3% annually, although wages, which are not in this because that was the employment data that we weren't able to get, one preliminary set of numbers that I looked at had wage appreciation at between 2.5% and 3%. While that still is not up to the 4.8% of average house price appreciation, I do have to say that is pretty strong wage growth, sort of unconfirmed, but pretty strong wage increase for a community. Of all the communities I've seen lately, that's better than most. Now, I said we were going to come back to the in-commuting, and I want to just touch on this briefly because I know this is where we're approaching the questions period. But this data set is available from the U.S. Census. It's a composite data set that is available. It's called the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics Data Series, which basically links geospatial data or referenced data by zip code all the way down to the block group level of unemployment insurance filings, and home area zip code. So what it gives you is the ability to identify where your community's workforce lives and where your residents work. What we're looking at here is where your workforce lives and the magnitude of commuting that comes in from these different directions. I've put them in the basic sort of cardinal coordinate system. You can see that that we did draw the trade area according to where most of the incommuting is actually coming from, and those are in the lower numbers. So from the south, there are from the Williamson County area, there are about 50, in 2013, these numbers have changed since then, but 2014 and 15 are not available yet. Nearly 57,000 workers in Nashville's labor market come from just the south. From the southeast, another 53,000 commute in for their work. From the southwest, 34,000, and directly east, another 39,000 people commute in for their jobs. And from the north, about 32,000, and then a total of about 18,000 come in from the west and northwest. Since 2002, though, some of these numbers have changed quite considerably. In this data set, the overall job increase because of the recession, actually because of the two recessions in this data set, first were reflective of, in 2002, of the recession that started in early 2001, and then second, also in the middle of this data set, beginning in 2007 was that recession for a year and 3 quarters. So the total job increase in this data set, which represents wage and salary jobs, was only about 14,000. But the total change in commuting was that in net, there were 14,000 more jobs in Nashville, but 12,000 of those were in commuters. And so this data set shows that there's been substantial increase in commuting from a number of those directions from communities south. So this becomes a sort of a regional issue at this point when you begin to talk about this, and it also elevates the some other issues that have come up in conversation. And I won't try to prompt you too much, but I'm sure it might come out in conversation now. I did just ramble off some of these numbers, but the other thing to point out is that in 2002, in-commuting represented 51% of Nashville's workforce, and by 2013, in-commuting represented 56%. While a 5% increase doesn't sound like a whole lot, you've got more people commuting in for jobs than live in the area. There are about 200, in 2013, there were about 250 to 60,000 people commuting in every day to their jobs. And you do have people commuting out to jobs in Brentwood, Franklin, wherever their jobs are, but it's nowhere near the magnitude of in-commuting. So, I'm not exactly sure how we could do this, but I would like any of the stakeholders to feel free to ask questions. And if anybody can't hear the question, I'll try to repeat it as best as I can. Avi, I think you had your hand up first.
Not a question yet, although I do have some. But just while those numbers look so good for so many people, our poverty rate has gone up this past year significantly. The number of people, according to the same census that you pulled some of the data from, out of 267 households in Davidson County, close to 100,000 are living on 35,000 or less. And they're the ones in the greatest need. And so those numbers look good, and they're worth celebrating, but there's one of the reasons we're here is the other picture.
Is there a data point or something that would be relevant to facilitate the discussion anymore that we might look at, that you might be suggesting? Yeah.
I do have some, I don't know if you wanted me to tell you now, but I wanted you to analyze the gentrification. How many households are losing, or how many people are losing the ability to stay in parts of the city? If you can show us that in terms of geographic data. And also, if you can find out people that are living substandard housing, that have problems like elderly that are living on a house that is not necessarily conducive for them to age in place, homes that have problems of mold or water damage. I mean, you may be able to get that data from the code department.
I'll have to be honest. In this case, that is information that's typically collected through consolidated planning processes and prepared with consolidated plans to assess substandard housing, to assess quality of unit conditions, and we might look at what has been collected there to see if there's something that can be used.
Yeah, because that will have an impact on people that are unintentionally being displaced because they can't stay on the houses.
The issue of gentrification is, while a sophisticated measure and an accurate measure of housing or market dynamics, it gets back to the point of consideration for future policy and for future updates. It's a data set that is often very difficult to identify. It's often a difficult data set to replicate. So if we hand this off back to the planning department, it needs to be something that the planning department would be able to do in the future, supposedly without another consultant.
What data I wanted.
Yes, and maybe I shouldn't give my reactions, but we'll write it down and we'll look at it.
Could you do a correlation between the non-owner occupieds that get sold and then demoed with the GIS and demolition permits, essentially just looking at the register of deeds and trying to compare both databases? Because I think that's one of the biggest mechanisms of gentrification, as council members talking about, is that they're going to infill and tear down one affordable rental and build back two higher-end homes, and so that stock is disappearing that much faster. Is that possible to create those metrics for that data?
We can look into it. That's a difficult one, but we can look into it. And it's the problem there is the reliability of that data. That's why I get paid the big bucks. Oh, is this thing on? That's not true.
I was curious to know why you didn't include you showed us the persons that are traveling into the city. That was very helpful data.
Yes.
But you put like 56%. But I'm interested to know what the residents are doing inside the city, at what rate they're commuting, because I think it is helpful in addressing affordability. To know what the people in the city are doing. So I would be interested in seeing that.
We have I might, just because you asked about it, and I know I have it in the back pocket. There is, let's get rid of this. This is out commuting. I don't think I don't have the same sets of numbers on this one, because in reviewing the slides for the presentation, we had to cut down on a number of things so we could get through the meeting in a reasonable amount of time. Out commuting is a component of that analysis, and so it's just in this context, the in commuting is more frequently an indicator of the pressures rather than the out commuting. The out commuting is more of a labor market issue. That is, if people are commuting out for higher paying jobs, for example, that might better be within the city, that's an economic development issue. Whereas in this case, if people are commuting in for service sector jobs, then it's a housing affordability issue. Otherwise it turns into a labor market issue where there might not be the appropriate type of jobs within the city. I'm not saying that's the case, but the out community is more an indication of other trends.
And too, I don't know though, because like I said, the information's not there. We don't know if the people in the city are prepared or can keep at pace with the new jobs that are coming to the city. And that's perhaps why more people are coming in. But we don't know because that data's not there. And then I'd be curious to know too what the developers have to say. I heard you say you were going to interview them, but I want to see how we get access to that information so that it's still open. It's not just you interviewing them and then presenting it, but we actually get to hear the feedback since we do set the policy. I think that would be.
Well, there were a couple developers we met with. I'll try not to look you in the eyes, but there were a couple developers we met with this morning, and I would hope that again through this process that this is an opportunity for open dialogue. It's an opportunity to ask questions and to offer suggestions. We will have more interviews with the development community and a subject matter focus group with the development community. As Carrie mentioned earlier, because a feasibility assessment is a component of this study, we will be working with them closely to vet our assumptions to ensure that they are appropriate for the market in terms of costs, hard costs, soft costs, market dynamics, and looking at different development prototypes. And that we will also discuss that development feasibility in this setting as well in a future meeting. Yeah.
Just because this is our first stakeholders meeting, I'm going to keep the questions. We need to keep the questions limited to the stakeholders group to be fair to the stakeholders group and the folks that we've advertised this as a limited stakeholders group meeting with public observation, but not necessarily public participation. So we have people who didn't come tonight recognizing that there wasn't a public participation aspect. So just wanted to ask that of everyone.
I think it would really help us if you would, or whoever the powers that be, give us a common definition of affordable. And I think that's a problem. You mentioned affordable in some neighborhoods. They think it's Section 8. Well, that's not what it is. Mm-hmm. Those of us who are have the privilege of working with federal funds, we have exact definitions and a headache of working with federal funds. We have exact definitions, whereas the market in general does not have that definition. You did mention one thing. You mentioned the 50,000 workforce. You mentioned workforce, which goes to 120. Well, that's basically $28 an hour and up to almost $40. Mm-hmm. And that is a need. I mean, we all agree, that's a need. But we would also need maybe to make those definitions in terms of dollars. I think that a lot of us in this room really care about the people making $10 and $15 and $20 an hour also being able to live within the county. And so transportation routes and these kind of things mm-hmm. brought up, and I really appreciate everything you brought up. So I would like to encourage you or someone to give us a common definition of affordable. I think it should include the federal definition because that's what the money includes, a lot of the money.
So maybe I'll just riff on that for a moment. Affordable housing is used very loosely in a lot of contexts, and it carries presumptions depending on who you're talking to. Of course, some communities call it workforce housing to identify specific categories, as you mentioned, Eddie, that there are categories of, say, workforce housing that some communities define as 80 to 120% of AMI, or even higher, up to 160% AMI, depending on the type of community it is. There is the federal definitions of affordable housing fall into the lower categories. The way I tried to distinguish it and to talk about it is in terms of development and in terms of housing affordability. There is really a threshold at about 80% AMI where home ownership doesn't make sense. That's one component of affordability that is pretty standard across the country. That is, it becomes too risky to get a household into an ownership unit at lower than 80% AMI because of the risk of default, because of the cost burden issues, and other things. In very general terms, though, there is another element of affordable housing that is important to identify. I mentioned the term cost burden. Cost burden is a measure. Years ago, people used to use rules of thumb like you should spend no more than 3 or 4 times your annual income on housing when you're looking to purchase a home. That's without really the consideration of whether or not a household has any equity built up or not. This is assuming standard sort of down payment assumptions. These days, it's translated into a percent of household income, and so at least for the past 15 years, the industry has used the figure 30% of household income. And that is, and Eddie, maybe if I'm addressing your question, I think this is the one component that I think is probably most important in household income for the household income consideration, that a household should spend no more than 30% of their income on housing. And that is really that number is really, that metric is informed by a number of things. That metric is informed by a lot of analysis, a lot of economic analysis, by people even smarter than I am. That was a joke, by the way. There is a lot of analysis and study and research that goes behind that. I have collected a lot of data on consumer expenditures, and I think I even have a slide back somewhere in this presentation that shows a bit of that. But generally, households should spend no more than 30% of their income on housing. And when we're translating income levels and when we're translating housing costs to income levels, we're often using that 30% of income metric in our definition of what is affordable, where there are affordability gaps, et cetera. Maybe.
It's still sort of cloudy with that definition. And I thought we could say, well, we would like a percentage of these under 60%, a percentage of these under 80%. I think that would be a clearer goal that we can all rally behind.
Yeah, I think the reason why I'm being intentionally vague about this is that we're not to the point in this process where we're looking at policy.
I'm saying down the road, we probably would help us.
We will do that.
Rally together.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I'll come back to you, Avi. I want to get some people who haven't had a chance to ask a question.
Piggyback on Avi's comment about, and I think the data point on that poverty thing, to me, and it hit a little bit on Councilman Gilmore's, I think, too, as far as wages. Really, if we could get some information that looks at the kind of the distribution of incomes between different ranges of incomes in the county. So the median is one thing, but within that can hide a lot of changes in how the income's distributed between different groups, and that's why you could have an increase in median, you could have an increase in poverty already. And so I think looking at it, the changes that are going on there and how that impacts housing affordability, I think is kind of important.
Thank you. Yes, we could evaluate that. Question.
When we do the electronic gathering, I was wondering if we could add a question in there somewhere on the lines of, do they plan on moving in the next 5 years out of Davidson County? Because as I look at this, I mean, I can't help but notice there is a lot of people leaving our county, and of course, got a lot of complaints saying, if I could move, I would. I'd go to Williamson County. I'd get my kids in those schools, So I would love to just kind of get a feel for who would really move, especially based on schools and, check it off and look at
Oh, sorry, you were talking to that other slide.
No.
Okay.
How they were leaving. So I was wondering,
Yeah.
what, are we going to have a little bit of you know, the next 5 years, a lot of transitional workers that are working here now that are on a, you know, a 2-year kind of job, you know, with a lot of our downtown workers. So I know that's not, but that could be just a question that you could have in the electronic information that we're gathering. So
Yeah.
it's not a study that you could do, but.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Just, I guess, a question. The scope of your project, you know, I can't help but noticing in the room, depending on which person we're talking about, you know, there's a focus on very low income people on up to 80 to 120, and different folks at different parts of that, they're, I think just their perspective brings them more focus to. Is the scope of your project to make suggestions for affordable housing options covering that whole range, or is there some subset that you've been tasked to focus more on?
That is a good question. I'm glad you asked that. The scope of services is vague in that regard. We are to look at a variety of income levels, but typically when we're looking at this type of an effort, and the working assumption, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that we're looking at we've been asked to look at the feasibility of an inclusionary zoning policy. And we're as I've mentioned before, other options are still on the table. And within that spectrum of policy options or tools, there are considerations for different income levels. It depends on where resources are coming from. Obviously, federal dollars come with the mandate to address lower income levels. But when we're talking about some of these issues and we're talking about workforce, many of these policies are typically addressed, if you're talking about ownership, we're talking about addressing 80% of AMI and above.
No, I fundamentally disagree with that. That's a different discussion.
Well, the reason is that on the 80% issue,
I understand where you're at.
the 80% is because of the ownership issues. This is, I say this not indicating that there aren't problems. There are other problems. But because there isn't a panacea approach, because there isn't one magic bullet that is going to cure the problems that exist for the workforce, the problems that exist at workforce for ownership, that exist for the workforce at rental levels, and that satisfies the needs at lower AMI levels that dip down into 30 to 60 and below 30% for supportive services. There are so many other issues in that there is no one solution, or there are certainly combinations of solutions, but it would have to be a very multifaceted approach to address all of those issues. It would really be a new comprehensive plan. So maybe it's Nashville next, or it's the second next, but it would really be a large process. And I don't mean to make a joke out of that, but it is a serious and a sort of a monumental effort to require that a policy be able to address all of that.
So my suggestion then is, as we go forward, to the point that Teddy made, and I think to Councilmember Gilmore's point too, I think as you go forward, we need some sort of nomenclature about which end of the spectrum we're talking about, because clearly I think the large consensus would be at the lower end of the AMI spectrum. It's not just the housing issue, it's jobs, it's wages.
Yeah.
That's not the case for the higher end.
Let me take a step back and maybe rephrase my answer to this, because this is a part of the process that is being formed right now. This is that question. I think I have a sense that was not an entirely accurate response for me to give. That is, there are so many different types of policy. There are so many different solutions, so many different resources, and they can all be used to address different problems. I'm not sure what the answer to the problem is at the moment. There are a lot of different possibilities, and a lot of those possibilities address a lot of different affordability issues. The reason why I mentioned the 80%, and I'll stop mentioning it after this, is that 80% is typically where ownership stops. After that, below that, you go into rental, because rental is more feasible to look at, between 60 and 80.
My follow-up to that is that I think many of us were anticipating, I know the council was, because I think they passed it into their ordinance, talking about workforce housing and affordable housing as two distinct things by definition. Right?
And just to be sure, can everybody hear when these questions are being asked? For the mic. So the oh, yes, I forgot. There's a mic standing in front of me. So that was whether the issue is that there was a distinction called out between affordable and workforce housing and both are included in the ordinance.
I don't think we're ready to just discard home ownership at 80% and below, because I mean that's completely different than where Nashville's been. I don't know if everybody knows that.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I'm just pointing out that it's part of it.
Could you provide a predictive analysis of the next business cycle? We're asking a lot, but a recent historic measure to demonstrate some great economic indicators. All business cycles have a unity concept. Is there a business cycle that could be at work? And is there any way to predict it?
That might be slightly outside of our scope. If I mentioned that I
need to be aware of, if you were sitting in Nashville and I was doing something different, I was overseas in 2006, you were getting these same indicators.
Mm-hmm. So the question was, can we formulate
the cycle? Does it apply to this question?
Yeah. So yeah, and I keep forgetting to repeat the question for the camera, but the question is about formulating a projection of the business cycle, and the business cycle for a variety of different industries is dependent on a variety of different fundamentals for each of the industries. I think, like I said, it might be slightly outside of our scope, but we can certainly put together some information on the we'll look at what we can do. That may consume more resources than it's worth.
I'm sorry, I've got a family thing I'm going to be getting from church. So.
Thank you for attending.
Are you guys looking at using city funds to fill the gap essentially from the 80 to 120, and that's because that's kind of more heavily looked at than where at 80 and below you have to kick in and use federal funding to fill that gap because that gap becomes that much bigger in home ownership programs? Is that essentially where that focus comes from? Is there a difference between what the city's looking at pitching in and what the federal funds available are?
So the question, is there a difference between the gap financing for a project that would use federal funding as opposed to local funding, because the local funding might address a higher AMI level?
It'll have less stipulations. Won't be the federal government.
I have an answer to that, but again, I would like to reiterate that at the moment, while we do have a working assumption for this study, there are a lot of other options that we would like to consider in this analysis. Among those, it's a bit premature to say that there is already a policy in place that is formulated and that is targeted to specific AMI levels. But the answer that I can give you is that generally the local funding dollars are going to come with fewer strings attached generally than federal funds. And the local funding source is probably going to be more reliable than the federal sources, given the recent declines in federal funding and the imminent decline in federal funding. So I want to make sure that Sam, I haven't gotten oh, actually, Eric, we haven't heard from you either.
I want Sam to speak before me, but real fast, this is all I wanted to clarify. I feel I shouldn't say anything at all. 60% of AMI and below is what the council and the administration have targeted for the Barnes Fund, just for everybody's reference.
Right.
So we talked about federal dollars, we didn't talk about those other types of flexible funding, so I just throw that in there for this conversation. And
Thank
it's
you.
rental primarily.
And is rental.
We just added home ownership in round 2. I think there's been some misconceptions around that, but it's mostly been rental units with adding in home ownership in our second round.
Yeah, okay. Clarification on that and additional point about the Barnes Fund addressing 60% and below.
I just have a kind of a dual question and comment. Looking at the rent rate for those who are renters, looking at the home ownership prices, and the rate at which all of that has increased in such a short amount of time, and to go on Council Lady's comment, how the transition of people moving in and out as their kids age. I look at my neighborhood, and the majority of the people that are moving there right now don't have any kids. But I'm wondering, will they be there in 5 years? And looking at what's happening in Houston and Austin and other cities, how long do you think Nashville will be able to sustain these type of rental rates and these prices? Will we price our own selves out of business? Or will this all end up being the best Section 8 housing in the country?
I won't make any, I've sometimes mentioned, so the question is, is the trajectory of Nashville that it will eventually price most people out of the market and rental rates will continue to escalate and create stability problems for neighborhoods, I think is what you're getting at, Sam. Well, the only thing I could do is pull from the anonymous other communities that I've worked at for the sake of not raising the issue of the fact that other communities are frankly different, but that in other communities that are further along in this sort of a cycle, if you will, of affordability issues, what results is that you hear more and more businesses talking about how hard it is to find workers. And how far away their workers are having to drive. You hear about employers and you hear from economic development folks that it becomes increasingly difficult to incent corporations and industries to move to an area. You begin to hear those kind of anecdotes more frequently, and I think you've already heard a couple anecdotes like that already.
I already asked a question, but I'd like to ask one before you leave.
Okay.
I wanted to ask, when I look at the number of people coming into Nashville for jobs, and understanding that we really can't talk about affordable housing without talking about poverty, I guess it kind of goes along with what Sam is talking about. Who bears the burden to really do affordable housing? Of course you're asking for developers, but then on the other hand, you say the community is going to have to give concessions. What does that look like? Who's really going to bear that burden?
I might jump forward in some of the slides because there's a slide where I think we are getting ahead of ourselves, but in a good way in terms of the evolution of the conversation. That as we look at, I'll come back to these affordability condition things. There are a set of questions that, and this is rhetorical, these are questions that are for us in the analysis. We need to look at how strong demand is, where it is, what market rate development is doing. Is it building housing that is affordable at certain AMI levels or not? How much is affordable to different AMI levels? Where is there overlap between some of these standard AMI ranges and what the market is actually producing, what inventory is available, what type of development it is, and then I mentioned the overlap piece of it. The thing that I wanted to advance to was this, and this is to your question. The solution or the set of solutions should really reflect what the problem is or what the problems are. And this is a question. The city is at a unique position where where all of you have been assembled and the community is trying to address what it has perceived to be a need. Some communities have gone about this in different ways and not taken the time to ask some of these questions. But some of the questions, for example, if employment and non-residential development are really at the root of the problem, then perhaps the solution lies somewhere in the area of a tool that directly addresses that. Perhaps a commercial linkage fee, excise taxes, other types of incentives, the use of TIF. If residential development and population growth pressures are really creating the problem, then you could look at something like an inclusionary policy, residential linkage, incentives, land banking, land trusts. The other things you could look at are if the community perceives that it is a community-wide problem, for example, the community acknowledges that it is their responsibility, then there are community-based solutions for this that are effectively mandates in similar ways to other policies. But for example, use of permanent funds, trust funds, local funding sources. I know that taxes are contentious in almost every environment that I work in. But there are successful stories of that use that is a broader base of where the solution fits the problem, and that the solution is tailored so that the responsibility is borne by the community that feels an obligation to deal with the need. And then the other one is, if some of those other tools aren't available, some of the other resources aren't available, then then other solutions can be tailored and targeted to deal with those things. I know at the moment that for example, in some areas, I think it is the downtown code or the UZO, where affordable housing is one of a number of different possibilities for the pursuit of extra height. And in some other communities I've worked with that have seen that affordable housing became an increasingly important issue, they removed some of those other options, placing the greater likelihood that affordable housing would be developed. So I wanted to jump ahead to those slides only for the purpose of addressing that question, which seemed very apropos at the time. So thank you. Avi.
So, one quick point and then a comment. The point being that we do have definitions for affordable and workforce. They were built into our ordinance. They were worked out with planning. We were comfortable with them. They're compatible with the state. And so that we have something to work off of. It's right in the ordinance. People outside don't get to make their own definitions up. Those are the definitions we agreed on and we're comfortable with. But the piece that I think is missing, and that bothered me in the very beginning of your presentation, and I just wanted to share that with you. A little bit set me off to think this way is the conversation about whether inclusionary zoning should be voluntary or mandatory, how it might come out. Clearly, what was the impetus for this gathering, for the work in the room, was that many sitting here and outside this room have a vision for our city that goes far beyond the it category that we so often read in the press. And that vision for our city is a city that is inclusionary, countywide, is a city where in our neighborhoods kids go to school with kids different than them, is a city where people have choice as to where to live, shop together, recreate together, Our vision wasn't a center of a city that looks all the same and can be afforded by only one element of our demographics, while everyone else lives far outside and has to travel inside. That wasn't our, that's what really set all this off. People that not only not have housing, but have very little availability to live where they too might want to. And I get that goes both ways. I understand that. So when we went through this process, it was clear that the language in our city adopted planning, our plan, our National Next Plan, a voice vote by our Planning Commission, to an ordinance and a resolution passed overwhelmingly by our City Council, that the core values were countywide, mandatory, inclusionary zoning. And that this study would test to what degree that would look like, not whether it would be absent or not. We were committed to the core value of countywide inclusionary zoning. And so, I'm here understanding that whatever we end up with has to be a balance. We talk. I'm certainly supportive of robust incentives for builders so that we can make this really happen. But I'm also absolutely still committed to that mandatory piece that will meet that vision of inclusionary zoning that we have all, not all, I can't say all, but many of us have owned into. And so this process doesn't get to redefine that. We've defined it already as a community. It was our conversation during our mayoral election. We gave our mayor a mandate, actually, when we elected her. So I'm hoping this process will help us figure out how that mandate can be implemented, not whether or not we have that mandate.
I think Carrie might want to say something. Thank you for, I appreciate you saying that, Avi. And Avi is correct that is the basis and the premise of the study. I think that if there's anything that needs to be highlighted again and again in this is that I think primarily what was identified was a vision, and I think that vision. In our minds, we are not advocates. We are analysts and economists. We have conducted housing policy feasibility studies in a number of communities of different shapes and sizes, and we have seen a variety of success and failure stories using this policy and other policies. And I think that we would be untrue to our expertise if we didn't evaluate other options as well, and if we didn't also take an unbiased perspective on whether inclusionary zoning as a mandatory policy is going to create an onerous environment or a negative environment that is too impactful on the development community, and if it isn't, how incentives could be structured to mitigate against those impacts, and what resources the community has to put forward toward that. The process of engagement is about identifying from the development community what incentives are valuable to them and how those might differ. But I appreciate this is walking a fine line between what we clearly recognize is we are at your service, at the city's service. We are analysts. We see the vision that you have, but we would not be true to our obligations as analysts if we didn't look at this from a wider perspective.
To follow that up, there are 500 communities using inclusionary zoning practices. Jim knows a lot of them. Some of our members, you know a lot, you've seen them. I'm hoping that they'll take the best from where they're working and help us figure out how to use them here. The reason why
I'm not just directly answering you and saying, no, that is not what we're doing, or yes, this is what we are doing absolutely, is that Nashville has a different market. Nashville is different from the other communities that I have worked in, that I've researched. Other people in the economic development world, the development world outside of even the city where I live. There are all different circumstances, and we need to understand what those circumstances are before we can really give a valid answer.
I think two things I would like for you to look at as well. One of them is, just from looking at the slides and the information you presented, it seems like there's a regionalism piece that is important to the affordability of the housing. When I say that, I mean the people that are coming in from the other counties and the people that are leaving out. And I don't know if that's a tax or how we do that, or sometimes we think a policy we make as a city are anti-regional, and if we do certain policies, then people won't allow our people to be hired in their particular city or county. So I think that needs to be explored. And also I would like to see where we are in terms of our building cycle. And I think Jim spoke a little bit to that, and I do think it's important. And some people feel like we're about to have a housing bubble again. And then you said something about speculative housing. So I would like to know kind of where we are in that cycle.
Okay. Good.
It's very important.
There was
yeah, go ahead. Somebody.
It was right behind you.
Well, if the councilman wants to speak.
Well, I thought maybe if he was going to ask the question, that was the final question for the meeting or something.
Yeah. Wonderful. That's a great segue into my question. Can you, or maybe this is planning, talk to us a little bit about the process from here forward with regard to this group?
I think when we all spoke, we were still finalizing the process, and truthfully, we still are. One of the tasks that David and I are going to tackle tomorrow before he leaves town is determining when our next meeting is and making sure that gets on everyone's calendar. We intend to have at least 2 more stakeholder meetings, one in November and one in December. Similar to this, where David will be presenting his findings, bouncing that information off of you, asking for your feedback and direction, as well as some of the smaller groups and targeted interviews. The groups that have met with David so far, and that we'll meet tomorrow, and other stakeholders as well, he'll be reaching out to with follow-up questions, and there'll also be public input, larger public participation meetings.
Where are we on time?
We are over.
We're over on time. If we want to respect everybody's time, is it we should just release everybody, or?
I do want to ask, will the slots be available to the stakeholders? That's okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
We plan on posting the slideshow on the web page. We have now on our left-hand side of the planning department homepage, there's a section that says inclusionary housing, has a little bit of detail on the stakeholder group along with the announcement of the first meeting. We do plan on posting the presentation there, as well as additional information as we continue through the process, that it's available to the stakeholder group as well as those outside of the stakeholder group.
So with that, thank you very much.